Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, whichever it is for you. My name is James, and welcome to episode 6 of the Writing with James podcast, coming to you almost live from my living room where we talk about life, the universe, and things you didn't want to hear in the first place. I've been heavy on the pro wrestling content on the YouTube channel lately, so I'm giving those that aren't really into wrestling but still want to support the channel a break. And we're going to get into something else this time around. I am on the verge of simply making it a pro wrestling channel, but I still want to leave the door open to do other things, and this podcast is one of them. Since Halloween is coming up, I wanted to take a look at the history of Halloween and how it started. And you can probably hear a saw running in the background. It never fails. Every time I start to do one of these, the neighbors decide to work on something. But we're just going to go ahead and march forth. The thing is, there isn't much to the story of how Halloween started, at least what can be confirmed. It's no secret I have a pretty big soft spot for Ireland and everything Irish, and Halloween has its roots in what is now Ireland. But the story of those roots was not particularly well documented. So, after talking about the roots of Halloween, I thought I would toss out some interesting stories, or at least I think they are interesting stories that are centered on Halloween. So we're going to have a little bit of a mixed bag this time around on the podcast. So if you'd like, take a ride with me, and we'll start where trick-or-treating and Halloween festivals get their roots. The origins of Halloween stem from Samhain. And yes, it's pronounced Samhain, not Samhain, despite what some American TV shows would have you believe. Samhain literally translates to summer's end in modern Irish. For the Celts who lived during the Iron Age in what is now Ireland, Scotland, and the United Kingdom, it was a 3-day pagan fire festival. And the festival ushered in the Celtic New Year, which, much like we celebrate New Year's Day on January 1st, it was seen as leaving the past behind and new beginnings. And of course, in the case of the Celtics, it also marked the end of harvest season and the beginning of winter that would bring new challenges. Now, exactly what happened during Samhain is a bit difficult to confirm. There are very few sources telling the Celt story, and most of the writings are actually from the Roman perspective, which downplay the festival. But with Samhain happening at the end of the year's harvest, it likely included a lot of things preparing for the winter, especially in pastoral communities. The Celts believed that the time of year going from summer into winter, or the light part of the year to the dark part of the year, was when it was easiest for spirits to pass through into their world. I'm sorry, I don't know if that's picking up as well on the microphone, but it sounds like somebody's running a sawmill right outside my window. But as part of Samhain, they would offer up sacrifices of crops and animals and bonfires to help appease deities and ward off evil spirits. It was also a time, pranks were played, or tricks, if you will. If it was to fool the spirits or fool the festival goers could be left up to debate. Celtic priests or druids believed the presence of these otherworldly beings gave them the ability to predict the future. So fortune telling was also part of the festival, being held alongside the bonfires. Many people who attended would wear costumes, trying to make themselves look like animals or beasts to fool any spirits present that might want to harm them. So you can already gather where some of the modern Halloween traditions stem from. Not only with the costumes, but also handing out candy, which you can sort of draw a line to sacrificing crops and animals in a way. We did leave out the bonfire on that one. Around the year 43 AD, the Romans conquered most of the Celtic lands, and along with that came the spread of Christianity and the Catholic Church. The Romans didn't put an end to the festivals, but over the years they would simply reframe them. This was somewhat subtle for hundreds of years as it pertained to Samhain, But in the middle of the 8th century, Pope Gregory III moved the celebration of All Saints' Day from May 13th to November 1st, and putting it right in the middle of Samhain. And All Saints' Day was established about a century and a half prior as a day to honor all Christian martyrs and saints, and was also known as All Hallows or All Hallowmas. The celebration of All Saints' Day was changed somewhat to more closely resemble that of Samhain, with bonfires and costumes. There was also offering of food and drink to the poor and other acts of generosity and goodwill. Of course, because of this, October 31st became known as All Hallows Eve, and eventually absorbed Samhain completely. Eventually that morphed into Halloween. We still follow a lot of the traditions, like the costumes, but the United States has added their own flavor to the holiday over the years, like pumpkin carving, which has even grown in popularity in Ireland in recent years. Like most holidays, even Christmas and Easter has become somewhat of a secular celebration with people that don't believe in other worldly spirits taking part, and some of the costumes aren't even that scary. In fact, my first full Halloween costume when I was a kid was Uncle Sam, and you can decide how scary that is. Okay, that is the story of Samhain as I know it. But now, from the first century to more modern stories, I'd like to go ahead and tell 3 stories related to Halloween. And a fair warning, a couple of these might be a little disturbing for some people, at least one of them. Okay, we start with a short one on Halloween of 1945 in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. It was the first Halloween after World War II, and a street party was being held on Queen Street East in a neighborhood known as the Beaches. It started simply enough, but as the early evening came around, the crowd began to grow, with an inordinate number of teenagers walking about. Slowly the number grew, later being described as scores of teenagers. They were all roaming the streets of the Beaches, and one police officer later estimated the number at 7,000. Nobody knows exactly what spurred the crowd, but eventually this massive group of teenagers became very rowdy. Bonfires were built in the middle of the street, with backyard fences being torn down to keep the blaze going. Even streetcar tracks were doused with gasoline and set on fire. When the fire department came to put the fires out, the massive crowd blocked the roads and prevented them from entering the area. Eventually, police did come, and being considerably outnumbered, were not able to do much when it came to calming the crowd down, but police did make 2 arrests and quickly left the area, taking them to the police station. The majority of the crowd began marching to the Main Street police station, breaking windows with rocks and turning on fire hydrants as they went, and chanting "Release them." This did prevent them from reaching the police station, but the crowd fired back by throwing rocks and pieces of concrete at police and firemen. Every available police officer in the city descended on the scene, and the police fought back. They began clubbing people in the crowd and managed to make 14 arrests, perhaps with some of the people in the crowd being brought back to reality and others simply wanting to avoid arrest. The crowd slowly began to disperse. Now, other than some young people simply getting caught up in the excitement, there was no clear reason determined for a crowd that big to become that rowdy on the spur of the moment. However, from the 16 individuals that were arrested, police learned that most of the teenagers that started the wild behavior were underclass youth that felt the end of the war robbed them of their chance to be war heroes. Now, seeing the preferential treatment veterans were getting as they returned home, many of the teenagers were actually looking forward to reaching the age they too could join the military. The end of the war brought an end to what some of them saw as an opportunity. Now, for our second story, it's nothing unusual for parents to check their kids' Halloween candy after a night of trick-or-treating, and certainly not a bad idea. Someone from my generation remembers when it was a very scary time for parents. On Halloween of 1974 in Deer Park, Texas, Ronald Clark O'Brien had dinner with his wife and friends before heading out for an evening of trick-or-treating with his two children, 8-year-old Timothy and 5-year-old Elizabeth. With them were his neighbor Jim Bates and Bates' son, along with some other kids from the neighborhood. At one home there was no answer at the door, so the group all scurried to the next house, all but O'Brien, who stayed behind. When he caught up to the group, he had in hand several giant pixie sticks, which were essentially brightly colored paper straws containing powdered sweetener. O'Brien told the kids that the homeowner had come to the door and handed them to him for the trick-or-treaters. Once they were all back home, Timothy asked if he could have some of the candy before bed and chose one of the pixie sticks. Pouring the colored sweetener into his mouth, Timothy complained that it tasted bitter, so Ronald gave him some Kool-Aid to wash the taste out of his mouth. And Timothy almost immediately started vomiting, then convulsing. Ronald called an ambulance, but unfortunately, 8-year-old Timothy died before reaching the hospital. Detective Bill Lanier arrived at the hospital and immediately started interviewing the family. After hearing the story, Lanier and several other detectives quickly covered the neighborhood and found 4 of the giant pixie sticks, including the ones O'Brien's daughter had and another that was clutched in the hands of a sleeping child who was unable to open the straw, which had been stapled shut. Luckily, none of the other pixie sticks, which all tested positive for containing cyanide, had even been opened. Over the next 2 days, police worked with O'Brien to try and pin down which house the pixie sticks came from, but it was proving to be difficult. It had been raining. They were trying to keep track of all the kids, plus O'Brien was dealing with the emotional shock of losing his son. O'Brien had trouble remembering which house or even which street they were on. He didn't get a clear look at the resident's face as he only peeked through a crack in the door and handed out the pixie sticks. After walking the neighborhood several times, Ronald finally pointed police to a house owned by a man named Courtney Melvin and told them he was the man who gave him the deadly treats. However, after a police investigation, Melvin didn't get home until after 11 p.m. Halloween night, long after O'Brien and his group had already headed home. Melvin was a supervisor at Hobby Airport, and more than 200 people could confirm his whereabouts at the time the pixie sticks were handed out. While some authorities were working with O'Brien, others were researching and uncovering some disturbing information. O'Brien had recently sold the family home to cover mounting debt and still owed money to numerous creditors. A month earlier, he had also purchased a $20,000 life insurance policy on each of his children, which was in addition to policies he had purchased the previous January. The morning after Halloween, literally hours after his son's death, he had contacted the insurance companies to inquire about collecting on the policies. Perhaps the most damning evidence against O'Brien was that the previous summer he contacted an acquaintance that worked for a chemical company, asking questions about cyanide and what amounted to a fatal human dose. Detectives believed O'Brien had poisoned his own son. Despite intense interrogation, O'Brien never confessed. Even though they were never able to determine where O'Brien got the cyanide, the mountain of evidence against him was enough to go forward with prosecution. O'Brien remained stoic and even cold during the trial, but with bursts of what might be described as dark humor. At one point, he offered the prosecuting attorney a Tootsie Roll. O'Brien's wife insisted she had no idea of her husband's plans and filed for divorce immediately after testifying against him in court. The jury took less than an hour to convict him, and he was sentenced to death. In 1979, O'Brien appealed the decision, but it was denied, with the judge saying that by distributing the other pixie sticks, it was clear he was willing to kill other children as part of killing his own child. All appeals that followed were denied as well. Rumors and tall tales of tainted Halloween candy have been around for decades, but O'Brien's case is the only confirmed deliberate Halloween candy poisoning fatality. O'Brien was executed on March 31, 1984, having never confessed to what he did. And finally, just after Halloween in 2011, Julie Keith of Damascus, Oregon, purchased what was called a graveyard kit from a local K-Mart. It was a set of Halloween yard decorations that included things like styrofoam headstones, skeleton hands, and fake spider webs. After Halloween, the price of the kit was marked down, and already planning for next year, Keith purchased the kit and tucked it away. When Halloween 2012 rolled around, Keith took out the black and orange box and finally ripped off the cellophane. As she removed the items, she found a curious-looking piece of paper wedged between the two headstones. Unfolding the paper, it was a handwritten letter in broken English that began, "Sir, if you occasionally buy this product, please kindly resend this letter to the World Human Rights Organization." The unsigned letter went on to say thousands of people were being held captive by the Chinese Communist Party government. The kit Keith now opened, according to the letter, was made in a labor camp where people were forced to work 15-hour days or more with no days off or holidays, being paid the paltry sum of 10 yuan a month, which is the equivalent of $1.61 US, which was the minimum wage per hour in the United States in 1968. The letter went on to say people were typically held in the camp from 1 to 3 years, and were mostly innocent people who were being persecuted over beliefs that did not align with the Chinese Communist Party. People faced severe punishment for what was deemed wrongdoing. Shocked at how daring it was for the author to risk writing the letter, knowing if it was all true they could have faced horrible punishment, Keith could not simply ignore it. At first, Keith wasn't sure who to turn to, so with hope of getting some advice, she went to Facebook. That eventually led to an organization called Human Rights Watch that had offices in New York. The spokesperson, Sophie Richardson, said there was no way to confirm if everything in the letter was valid, but the conditions in the letter did match up with what they knew about re-education through labor camps in China. Eventually, U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement were informed of the letter, and ICE's Homeland Security investigations began looking into the matter. Even Sears Holdings Corporation, which ran K-Mart at the time, said they would continue to investigate, though they never revealed any findings. A year later, the letter writer came forward, only identifying himself as Yang, a 47-year-old who spent 2 years in the camp. Yang wrote 20 of the letters, placing them in boxes that had English writing on them with the hope they would be sold in America. Yang fantasized about the letters being discovered overseas, but after some time gave up hope. In 2017, having fled China to Indonesia, Yang finally revealed himself to be a man named Sun Yi, an engineer who had been running an underground newspaper that was critical of the Chinese Communist Party. Yi had been arrested several times before for practicing the meditation-based philosophy of Falun Gong, which was banned in China, but it was his newspaper that put him in the labor camp for 2.5 years. He began writing the letters he hid in the graveyard kits in 2008, eventually enlisting some other prisoners to help distribute the letter. After one was discovered, all the practitioners of Falun Gong were rounded up and tortured. During his last year in the camp, Yi was subjected to horrendous treatment, being held with a ball gag and strapping his wrist to the top of a bunk bed, where he was left to dangle for days in an attempt to make him denounce Falun Gong. He never did. It was only after his sister contacted a human rights lawyer that she was allowed to visit him, and he was eventually released. Yi continued to tell his story under a false name, doing interviews with CNN and a Canadian filmmaker. Yi was arrested in 2016 when he attended the trial of a fellow Falun Gong practitioner, but was released when a blood pressure spike sent him to the hospital. However, his phones were confiscated, and knowing it was only a matter of time before they came across the encrypted correspondence about the labor camps, he boarded a flight to Indonesia, the one place that doesn't require passports for visitors from China. In 2017, Julie Keith flew to Indonesia and met Sun Yi. Keith told Yi she feared she had put his life in danger. Yi simply said he thanked her forever. Unfortunately, Yi would pass away later that year from kidney problems, but at least knew his daring actions revealed what went on in the labor camps. Okay, I decided to end it on something of a positive note. I'm not even sure, but this might be somewhat of a short one. I just thought it would be interesting to look at some Halloween stories. And I hope that gets you ready for this Halloween and reminds you to check the kids' candy before you let them tear into it. I did want to mention that the channel hit 1,900 subscribers recently, and I'll be coming out with a special video for that next. So that's 2 non-wrestling videos for you. How about that? But I will have more wrestling content coming. I know most of these new subscribers came because of the wrestling. But for now, thanks for coming along for the ride. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe. Not necessarily in that order. And I will see you next time.